Welcome everyone. My name is András Szeberényi and I'm a college professor at Budapest Metropolitan University, and I'm also serving as the head of the marketing department. For about 15 years, I have been conducting research on sustainability, and for the past 5 years, I have focused specifically on the various symptoms of climate anxiety. During this time, I have carried out several studies examining different symptom clusters across generations X, Y, Z, and Alpha. This is why I titled my presentation Understanding the Psychological Impacts of Climate Change, and also because I believe this topic is particularly relevant today. When we discuss climate change, most people still primarily think of heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, or economic damage. While these are indeed critical consequences, it is becoming increasingly clear that the climate crisis also has a significant psychological dimension. It is not only reshaping the natural world, but also how people perceive the future, safety, personal responsibility, and daily life. In today's presentation, I want to demonstrate why these psychological reactions matter, how they manifest, and why we must not overlook them. As a starting point, it is essential to note that the climate crisis is not just an ecological, but also a mental health issue. Several global studies have already examined the state of mental health worldwide. One such report, conducted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2022, revealed that nearly 1 billion people are living with mental health conditions, a situation that climate change further exacerbates. Another study carried out by the World Health Organization that same year found that out of 95 participating countries, only 9 have integrated mental health and psychosocial support into their national climate strategies. This means that while an increasing number of people feel the psychological burden of climate change, institutional responses remain quite limited. This is particularly concerning because climate change is no longer a distant or hypothetical threat. We are already struggling with numerous physical and mental symptoms that have become a constant presence in our lives. The question, therefore, is no longer whether climate change has psychological consequences, but rather how quickly we can understand them and find effective ways to address them. I suspect some of you may have heard very little about eco-anxiety until now. Our next step is to define the concept itself. While many researchers have approached this term from various angles, I believe René Lertzman's definition captures this complex state most effectively. She describes eco-anxiety as a psychological condition that an individual or society feels when they are worried or anxious about global climate change and its potential effects. I find this definition particularly useful because it applies to both the individual and the societal levels simultaneously. To be clear, eco-anxiety is not just about hearing bad news and feeling momentarily down. We are talking about a deeper, more persistent reaction that eventually becomes a constant presence in one's mind. It involves a sense of uncertainty, fear of the future, and a perceived loss of control. The feeling that even though we see the problem, we may not be able to change the outcome. At the same time, it is vital to emphasize that eco-anxiety is not a clinical illness in itself. Rather, it is a psychological response to a global crisis that people perceive as real, immense, and difficult to manage. At academic and professional conferences, I have often been asked whether eco-anxiety is a genuine, real problem or just a form of eco-hysteria from people seeking attention. I believe this is a fascinating yet sensitive question. This is precisely why I wanted to present these two distinct viewpoints. One perspective suggests that eco-anxiety is in certain cases an exaggerated or amplified reaction. In this view, social media, sensationalist news, and the constant stream of negative messaging play a key role. Furthermore, some interpret this as generational sensitivity, often shifting the blame onto members of Generation Z, specifically those born between 1994 and 2010. This standpoint essentially views the phenomenon as a cultural or emotional overreaction. The other side, however, emphasizes that eco-anxiety is a very real issue because it has measurable psychological symptoms. Research shows that environmental concerns can cause lasting emotional strain, particularly among younger generations. Most importantly, this fear is not directed at something imaginary. It is a response to a real, ongoing, global crisis. In my opinion, we should not oversimplify the issue by choosing one side over the other. While exaggerated reactions may occur, the phenomenon itself remains genuine. Therefore, it is counterproductive to either downplay or overmystify it. Instead, we must understand how, in what life situations, and with what intensity it manifests in different individuals. Now that we have defined eco-anxiety, let's look at the climate emotion scale, which adds further nuance to this condition. This 9-level scale highlights that emotions related to climate change are not condensed into a single feeling. We are not just talking about fear or anxiety. On this scale, we encounter concepts such as oiteria, which describes an intensely positive connection to the earth. This is a state where individuals almost worship the environment. Soliphilia is another positive emotion. While less extreme, it involves a deep love and responsibility for the planet. The shift toward negative emotions begins with solastalgia, in which individuals feel distress from environmental changes around them. Beyond simple climate anxiety, we also see ecoparalysis, which is often a sense of being frozen or unable to respond effectively to ecological shifts. Eco-guilt is another interesting phenomenon. It often arises when someone feels shamed for not doing enough to protect the environment, such as driving instead of using public transportation, buying non-eco-friendly products, or failing to recycle. Eco-grieving is a particularly serious symptom. Those affected feel the same sense of profound loss from environmental destruction as one does when losing a close relative. This can lead to depression or, in more severe cases, environmental post-traumatic stress disorder, resulting in a traumatic and fragile state of mind. As you can see, human responses to the environmental crisis are far more complex than we might initially think. Some feel guilt because they believe they are not doing enough. Others experience grief as they witness the loss of nature and the transformation of the seasons. For some, a strong bond of love drives their sense of responsibility. In short, climate change triggers not only fear, but also shame, loss, love, hope, and significant moral pressure. Another fascinating psychological mechanism closely linked to this topic is moral licensing, also known as self-licensing. Essentially, this means that if someone has previously done something they consider moral or correct, they find it easier to excuse themselves for less consistent or negative behaviors later. For instance, if someone recycles, uses tote bags, eats less meat, or drives an electric car, they can easily develop a sense that they have done enough good. Consequently, they might perceive air travel, excessive consumption, or frequent online shopping as less problematic. This phenomenon is significant in climate change psychology because it highlights that people do not always act consistently. Often, the issue is not a lack of knowledge, but rather a matter of self-justification. While this mental mechanism can alleviate guilt and provide short-term relief, it can also hinder genuinely sustainable behavior. What we learn from this is that identifying as environmentally conscious does not guarantee that every decision will be consistent with that identity. This is not necessarily due to bad intentions. Instead, it is often a form of psychological self-defense. This slide illustrates additional emotions and circumstances linked to the factors influencing climate change. As we have learned, climate change does not trigger a single, isolated psychological reaction. Instead, it interacts with various social and personal factors. This figure displays both positive and negative emotional concepts. If we look back at the COVID pandemic, we likely remember the experience of being confined to our homes for months and the fear of infection. Since then, several studies, including those from Harvard University, MIT, and Oxford University, have examined how the pandemic amplified existing eco-anxiety symptoms. For instance, Harvard's research revealed that American women between the ages of 18 and 25 are significantly more sensitive to climate change. Many in this group already struggled with anxiety-related symptoms, which the pandemic further intensified. For 20% of the women surveyed, eco-anxiety was the initial emotional symptom, which evolved into eco-paralysis or PTSD within about a year. Another 6% experienced a drastic decline, manifesting as climate rage or intense frustration. It is worth noting that these emotions were a blend of concerns regarding both the virus and environmental change. Conversely, a 2024 study from Fudan University highlighted that lockdowns led to a sudden improvement in air quality in major Chinese cities, which triggered positive emotions. In just 1 year, the pandemic achieved air quality goals that China had been unable to meet for 5 decades. In this sense, emotional reactions to climate change are not exclusively negative. While fear, helplessness, and anxiety are present, we also see a cluster of emotions involving interest, hope, and commitment. This is crucial because our goal is not to eliminate every negative emotion, but to ensure these feelings lead to a more conscious response rather than paralysis. This diagram illustrates the dynamics of trauma and highlights how the sense of helplessness evolves over time. There are instances where a severe event suddenly disrupts a person's life, triggering immediate shock, fear, or grief. In other cases, however, helplessness develops more gradually as an individual feels a diminishing sense of control over a deteriorating situation. This dynamic is especially critical in the context of climate change because it often combines sudden shocks with prolonged uncertainty. People are not just experiencing isolated events, they are witnessing a gradual, persistent decline while feeling they have no real agency or influence to change the outcome. In summary, I would like to share 3 clear messages. First, the fight against climate change is no longer just about water and air pollution, deforestation, or extreme weather. It causes psychological, physical, and mental symptoms across every generation. This means that climate change cannot be treated solely as a technical or environmental policy issue. We must take the psychological dimension just as seriously. Second, we must seize every opportunity to initiate necessary changes, whether through programs, grants, subsidies, or educational and community initiatives. Every effort is vital. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, if we truly want to address environmental problems, we must also mitigate the mental symptoms. When people feel chronically helpless, exhausted, or indifferent, it becomes much harder to motivate them to take action. Supporting mental well-being is not just a health issue. It is a prerequisite for a sustainable future. In closing, I want to emphasize that the psychological consequences of climate change are not imaginary, they are not a superficial trend, and most importantly, they are not phenomena we can afford to ignore. We can debate how intensely they manifest in different individuals or discuss the extent to which the media amplifies these feelings, but the reality of the phenomenon remains undeniable. The sooner we understand this, the better our chances of moving away from paralysis toward conscious adaptation and a genuine drive for action. Taking action against climate change is therefore not only a technological or economic task, it is also a human and a mental health priority. If we take this seriously, we can protect our environment while simultaneously strengthening our mental well-being. Thank you very much for your attention.